People say we can't escape or cut through all the red tape, but I say we can make a difference, we can turn it around, we can make a difference if we get it moving, things will start improving, we can make a difference.
Hello, everyone. We are going to just wait a few more moments before we get started, and at that point, we will mute everyone except for myself, Raven, and Liz, and then we will get started. Oh, I got a friend request from someone at JemCon. Confirm. Damon, I'm being told that you have a wonderful background.
I know, I love that. I just saw.
Isn't that awesome?
Oh, there it is. That's amazing.
And Brandy, I'm noticing your portraiture in the background. Really appreciate that.
Oh, wow.
Thank you. These are actually paintings I made to take over to the protests and the vigils that we had in the Fresno area through here. This one actually has like a list. It's not completely scrolled out, but I included the list of names to it. And we had this displayed and carried and stuff. Just as a little thing, I actually have this one on my Etsy page and on my personal art page as a that I'm selling small prints to support the Portland medics for the protesters in Portland. So I can, if anyone's interested, I can drop a link.
Yeah, please drop the link, Brandy. They're great. You're such a great artist.
Thank you so much.
Raven, Liz, are you both ready to get started?
Yep.
All right, so again, we're
Yes.
going to ask everyone to keep yourselves on mute.
I am Raven, and this is my 5th JemCon and first virtual, which technically means it's 6. And I would like to welcome you all to the Black Lives Matter workshop. I am actually born and raised in Chicago. I currently work as a paralegal, and I am between law firms right now, but hopefully that'll change. I've done some litigation and some other civil matters and situations of that sort. But right now, our society is tense with a lot of issues that take on legal personas, as well as social and social perception personas. And we'll get into some of those things as we go through our discourse this afternoon.
So hello, everyone. My name is John Hellman. I'm one of the JemCon staffers that you've probably seen before if you've attended a session the last few days. This is my 5th JemCon, 4 in person and 1 virtual. And I'm really grateful to see so many people attend this very important session. Just a little bit about myself. I have a master's in humanities from NYU, where I looked at gay community formation through a racist lens to talk about how whiteness and gay community formation coincided with each other. And I also have over a decade of nonprofit experience working primarily with communities of color on issues like HIV and AIDS, other health issues, poverty, the war on drugs, and so on and so forth. From the US as a whole to a focus on the South Bronx, a whole mess of stuff. So that's a little bit about me. And again, thank you all so much for being here.
Well, I'm Liz Pemberton, and this is my 16th JemCon. And I am a musician who is at the moment otherwise unemployed, so you can see my qualifications. But luckily, I'm just doing admin stuff. So Raven and John have done a fantastic job preparing for this, and I'm very excited to see what they have. I think this is going to be a very good thing. As we posted on Facebook yesterday, and as unfortunately some of you experienced in person, we had someone, we think it is just one person, who was sending racist messages through the Zoom chat. We are horrified by that. We have taken steps to prevent that from happening, one of which was to restrict the chat so that attendees can message the host but not other attendees. And we're sorry to have lost that more personal aspect of things, but unfortunately that's what we had to do. We are also looking at the screenshots that people have sent us and reviewing our Zoom videos where this was reported to have happened. These messages were sent under fake names. One of the fake names was JemCon. One of the fake names was Jansen. And so this does not only hurt the people who are receiving the messages, it hurts the people whose names are being stolen to send them. And so we are just horrified on everyone's behalf. And this is a problem that Zoom has. We had hoped we would not, we had naively hoped we would not have to deal with it, but we do. So on behalf of JemCon, I am so sorry. And we will continue to do what we can to prevent the actual harassment from happening in the ways that we can prevent it. And we will work to try and keep the people that we can prove are responsible for it from being part of our community. So again, we're very sorry, and we thank you for being loving people who respect each other.
No, thank you, Liz, for talking about that. And something that Raven and I will both be talking about in very different ways. It's really important that as we celebrate a universe that we love, that we make sure that we acknowledge and understand everyone's lives that come to our space and the issues that might come up that have nothing to do with Gem, but unfortunately remind us that we are in a society with a tremendous amount of problems, in particular when it comes to how society treats Black folks. We have 2 videos to play, but Raven, I wanted to see if you wanted to say something before we started those 2.
I would simply concur with what you've said on the point that while we do embrace the fact that GEM is a very open and inclusive community, we recognize that there are people who are influenced by the things that are around them that they bring to the GEM community. And it is unfortunate that those things do kind of seep through in their interactions and the ways that they talk back and forth with people and share certain things. So that is definitely a valid point. And that would be all that I would share at this moment. And I'm ready to proceed as you are.
All right, thank you, Raven. I'm gonna load the videos. Everyone's favorite thing, figuring out Zoom for a second. So just give me one moment.
Black Lives Matter. This is a phrase that causes a lot of people to have a strong reaction, and it's something that all of you have probably heard one way or another over the last few months. The death of George Floyd, after getting a knee to his neck for almost 8 minutes by a police officer, sparked another wave of national attention to Black Lives Matter. And there are a lot of questions about why Black Lives Matter, why the phrase, why are we talking about racism, and what exactly do they want? We put together a guiding document so that you can understand some basic concepts in order to understand racism a little bit better. But I want to talk about 3 in particular that for me really helped me understand why we're still talking and why we continue needing to talk about Black Lives Matter. The first point is that there is a legacy of violence against Black people in this country with little to no justice. When we're taught in our schools about US history, slavery comes up and the Civil War comes up and we talk about the 60s a little bit, and that's basically it. But did you know that there are lots and lots of examples of massacres, of murders, of uprisings in this country against Black people that I had no idea. I'm sure many of you didn't have any idea. And I want to just talk about a few of them. On August 5th, 1896, in Texarkana, Arkansas, there was a group of white farmers that murdered black farmers because they were threatened by the fact that there were black folks that were trying to be economically self-sufficient. In May 31st, 1921, and there's a similar example in January 1st, 1923, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Rosewood, Florida, respectively, white mobs murdered and destroyed lots of property from black majority towns simply because they were there and they were threatened by anything that looked like black power, black self-sufficiency. They did nothing to deserve it except that they were there and they were not under white power or white control. In the 50s and the 60s, which we do learn about a little bit, so many of the great leaders of the civil rights movement were murdered or assassinated. Medgar Evers, Fred Hampton, Harry Moore, Harriet Moore, Malcolm X, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., they were all seen as very, very widely unpopular figures at the time, and they were murdered. May 13th, 1985, I can't think of any other example in any other context that this happened, but a black neighborhood in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania was bombed by the government in a standoff between black organizers and activists and the government. These are just a few examples of the legacy of violence against black people that make us wonder, why don't Black Lives matter? When in fact they do, but the history of this country would lead us to a different conclusion. The second thing, and this is something that has been very particular to the George Floyd national attention, is that in this country, the police are rooted in slave patrols. There's a really excellent book that I encourage all of you to read. It's called Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. It's this book here. And I just want to read a short passage. In a study of slave patrols in Virginia and the Carolinas from 1700 to 1865, historian and law professor Sally E. Haddon writes, quote, "People other than masters or overseers had legitimate rights, indeed legal duties, to regulate slave behavior," end quote. Black people escaping to freedom were hunted down to prevent labor loss to their white slavers, and also to send a message to those enslaved who might be strategizing to lose their chains through rebellion or insurrection. In this chapter, Dunbar Ortiz goes through all of the colonies and highlights, and this is recorded history, written charters where white men were empowered, often armed with guns, to regulate the behavior of any black person that they saw, that they had the right to detain them and they had the right to return them to their owners. How you can tell a slave versus a freed person, it didn't matter. They had the legal authority by local and colony charter to act as police to these black folks. And that is literally the foundation of the police force in this country. When we talk about the racist police, we're not necessarily talking about every individual's attitude and them thinking consciously or even unconsciously that black people are inferior. However, when one officer does something wrong and 4 police officers do nothing to stop him or her, what does that say about the attitudes of the police force? Those are personal attitudes that are ingrained in this institution that is rooted in the policing of slaves. So we have to be able to have an honest conversation about what is the function of the police in neighborhoods that are majority black. What is the function of the police? And when black folks are disproportionately arrested, they're disproportionately imprisoned, and they disproportionately receive longer jail sentences, we have to ask harder questions about why the police targets black people, and it's in our history. The third thing that I want to talk about is this refrain that we hear in response to Black Lives Matter, which is all lives matter. And on the one hand, it's ridiculous, but on the other hand, if you, like I mentioned before, if you learn US history and you learn about the Civil War and the 60s and segregation a little bit and nothing else, it is actually very understandable to think racism doesn't exist. Why are these people making such a big deal out of something when white people are killed by the police, or white people kill each other? All kinds of people kill each other. What's really important that we need to do is do our homework and research and read, and also understand that the way that we were taught had a very specific function, which was to hide a lot of the atrocities and these examples that I brought up, and there are countless others, of times when in every state in this country, Black people were somehow disenfranchised, dehumanized, or even murdered. So when we talk about Black Lives Matter, in response to these 3 points, what are we trying to do? We're trying to say that the violence against Black people, the disproportionate violence against Black people, is unacceptable. We're trying to say that the police need to understand, if you look at the data, if you look at the history, racism is something that you cannot detach from our ideas of the police force. And we need to work together to rethink what the function of the police is, and whether there are other things that we need to invest in order to prevent those crimes from happening in the first place. And 3, we need to help each other and educate each other about what's going on in this country, what has happened in our history, so that we can all be on the same page and come to the conclusion that Black people have faced numbers and numbers of injustices and continue to face injustice in this country. The ending of slavery was very important, but at every turn, we have made it impossible for Black folks to exercise their right to vote, to drive down the street, to go shopping, to walk down the street, to wear a hoodie. All of these reasons why white folks decide that these Black people are threatening and that they deserve to be murdered. I hope you stay tuned for the second video in this presentation, continued by the discussion, because it's really important that we all come together to solve this. Ending racism not only undoes the disproportionate violence and disproportionate dehumanization that Black people face, but it makes this country, and it would make our community spaces, and would make this entire planet a better place for everyone. We all suffer from the impact of racism, and it's our opportunity and it's our obligation to do our part to say this is not acceptable, and to say that Black Lives Matter. So please continue staying tuned, and most importantly during this time, wear a mask.
George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Javed Amber II. This is the beginning of a long list of Black people who are now dead due to simple interactions with the police, while names like Roger Stone, Dylan Roof, and Brock Turner join a list of white people who have survived to be convicted of their wrongs. We know that Black people are about 13% of the United States population. However, in 2019, Black people and minorities comprised almost half of the prison population, with some of them serving sentences up to 20% longer than their white counterparts who've done the same things. Let's examine some quick cases of situations where the facts of the case were very similar, but the outcomes were very, very different. Consider a student athlete who was convicted of raping an unconscious woman. The sentence, minimum 25 years, because that was Corey Beatty. We're familiar with the situation regarding Brock Turner because he only got 6 months and served only 3 of it, getting off for supposed good behavior. In another case, we look at a parent who seemed desperate to give their child the best education possible. She was sentenced to 5 years in jail and 5 years probation. Of course, I'm not talking about Felicity Huffman, who only got 14 days and served 11 of them because it was arranged that when she would surrender, the end of her sentence would be on a holiday, which would allow for her to be released sooner. She got 1 year probation for this particular crime of bribery to secure a spot in the school for her daughter. But Tanya McDowell got 5 years in jail, as well as 5 years probation for saying that her son lived with her father in a particular neighborhood when she and her son were actually homeless. So we're looking at situations here where the parent did a bona fide wrong, but the sentences were still surprisingly and unfortunately different. I use these common examples to make the point that racism is not very hard to find if you're looking for it, even in this society. Along with these, we see Black people who have actually committed crimes and were punished a lot more severely. But what about the situations where the Black person was convicted of a crime they did not commit? Let's consider the case of Reuben Carter. He was a middleweight boxer who was accused of a triple murder, and he served a sentence of 20 years before it was discovered that exculpatory evidence had been suppressed. In 1975, Bob Dylan wrote a song about this, and in 1999, Denzel Washington starred in a movie about this. Both tributes were named after the boxer's moniker, the Hurricane. He was actually released from jail in 1985. For another example, let's look at the case of Walter McMillian. He was convicted of murder and put on death row for murdering a man he had never met, who lived in a city where he had never been. This is the story that's featured in the movie Just Mercy. He was released from jail in 1989. I use these examples of convictions that happened in the 80s and the release that happened in the 80s to make the point that racism is not as far back in the annals of history as people like to believe it is, as we've seen to have come so far. If you believe that racism is an accident and the burden of just the few who believe that way, please reconsider. There are plenty of books and articles that have been written on the supposed inferiority of the Black race. For example, in 1753, Enlightenment philosopher David Hume said expressly, "All races are created unequal." Philosophies like this continue with John Smith via Edward Arbor, who said the Black body was as devilish as any people. Continuing on up to 2006, we have another article that referred to the cruel disposition of those creatures. In 1831, succeeding Texas legislators sought protection against ruthless savages. In 1903, Senator Benjamin Tillman said exactly, "The poor African has become a fiend, a wild beast seeking whom he may devour," as a reflection of the previously noted quote that Black people were inherently devilish. Now consider that language, seeking whom he may devour. Might that be familiar to you? If so, you have probably read or come across the Bible, where in 1 Peter 5:8, it says that exactly about the devil. The mindset that Black people are inferior is not an accident, and there are plenty of articles and books that prove it. Maybe you haven't read any of these, but someone has. And some of those people have passed that ideology on to their successive generations, who now hold various offices or may just walk the streets belligerently using the N-word. Abolitionist William Lord Garrison said expressly, "Nothing has been left undone to cripple their intellects, darken their minds, debase their moral nature, and obliterate all traces of their relationship to mankind. That was his reflection on the treatment of Black people as a whole. And we can see this reflection still depicted in mainstream media, where in many movies, Black people are usually thugs, criminals, or some other unsavory character. And Black women especially are always the sassy, angry sidekick or the best friend with the attitude. I say these as are common examples to make the point that racism is not as far back in the annals of history as many would like to believe, and the idea that racist practices are not an accident or simply the burden of a few people. As broad as the topic of racism is, surely you might have questions. Please stick around. We have more information coming and a panel discussion, after which we try to address some of your questions.
Raven, what do you have any response to the two videos, and do you want to just talk about why you got involved in this workshop for JemCon in the first place?
I'll start with the second question. I got involved in this particular workshop as an invitation, really. I was planning on participating in JemCon on the organizing side this year, as I had first attended as an attendee for 5 years prior. But after the world flipped upside down, we made changes to accommodate those cartwheels. And one of those was the civil unrest that had been sparked again by the murder of George Floyd. I was invited to review the Black Lives Matter statement that came forth from the JemCon staff, and further invited to participate in this particular workshop. And this opportunity is definitely very near to my heart and very, very, very strongly appreciated for being given this privilege. This first question you asked if I wanted to comment on the two videos. I wanted to do something that I don't know that we've accounted for. Many times people ask, why are Black people so featured and so targeted when it comes to police and matters of crime and things of that sort? John, you touched on that with the origin of the police, but here's something else that people might not have been aware of. The wording of the 13th Amendment, and let me share it with you here. It says exactly in section 1, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof a party shall be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject unto the jurisdiction. Section 2 was that Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Now let me underscore why this is important. It says exactly, people understand that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but how? Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, parentheses, except as a punishment for a crime wherever the party shall be duly convicted, close parentheses, shall exist within the United States or any place subject unto their jurisdiction. Slavery was abolished as a legal practice unless the person was determined to be a criminal. Once that criminal determination was made, all holds, no holds were barred at that point. Everything was open. You could do anything that you wanted to do to these particular individuals because that clause exists situated within the 13th Amendment. So while technically slavery is illegal and involuntary servitude is also illegal, this same amendment gives people the legal leverage that they need to employ these same tactics on people who've been determined to be criminals. And that's one of the reasons that we look at the population of prison and we're looking at more than half being Black people and minority in 2019, because that loophole in the amendment that abolishes slavery is big enough to drive a truck through. If you decide that someone's a criminal, then it no longer applies to them and we can do anything.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's such an excellent point. And I remember when I was in grad school, I had the opportunity to see Angela Davis speak. For those of you who don't know who Angela Davis is, she is one of the one of the most important activists of our generation, who was very involved in the Black Panther Party, and she's been doing such incredible work. She's a professor now, and her work focus right now is prison abolition. And I remember someone in the audience asking, what was the connection between the work that you did as a member of the Black Panther Party and prison abolition? And she simply stated, it's because prisons are slavery. And it was a way for this system that was very important to the United States to take a different, to be transformed and take a different shape, so that white supremacy could be maintained, even though this legal status of slave was technically changed.
Yes. And one easy thing that they had begun to do in 1865 and 1866, right after the passage of this amendment, it was written into law that you must have a job. So now we have people who've been emancipated and are now free citizens. The law now says you have to have a job. And they could, these newly free citizens could then be arrested for not having a job. And once they're arrested for that, they became criminals. And and all of the emancipation that they had just experienced was again of null and void, because they had been determined to be criminals by not having a job based on this new law that sprang out of nowhere once the amendment was passed and given constitutional authority to be in effect.
No, absolutely. Thank you. So I think it's clear, hopefully to everyone listening, that we are both very passionate about this issue. But Raven, this is JemCon. Why are we talking about it now?
One of the reasons that we are talking about this here in JemCon stems back to the original, the beginning introductory comment about the fact that people are genuinely influenced by the society in which they live, and wherever they then circulate, they bring elements of that influence. So if we are at JemCon as a whole, a collectively inclusive community, there are people who may have come into the community bringing their societal influences and are then able to, unfortunately, share those influences in obviously negative ways. Specifically, as we're talking about the cartoon, and one of the ways that some of that influence has been imposed upon me as a Black woman, people have suggested to me that the only character I should cosplay is Shayna. And they've determined that because Shayna's character is the Black avenue of Jem and you're Black, then that's the only trajectory that you have within this community. Now, again, that obviously isn't the motif of the Jem community at large, but there have been people who've made those types of comments to me. And it comes off in a way that when they say those things exactly, and they're not realizing just how unconscious their racist biases are, it's unfortunate. Because then if I decide to respond in some type of anger, I've just solidified every stereotype they have about Black women. At the same time, if I don't say anything about that, I've substantiated every Black stereotype that they have about what my cosplay is supposed to look like specifically. And that was very troubling to me. It became very apparent very shortly after I began coming to JemCons. And as I mentioned, that isn't the attitude of the community at large, but there are a few people who have made those types of comments to me and said those types of things. On that point, especially also, because racism is so unconsciously and prevalent, Asian women have also endured the same type of difficulty regarding Aja. It's been suggested that Aja is the only person that they can cosplay because of the ethnicity aspect. It's been again suggested that only I should cosplay Shayna because of that aspect. But in a quick demonstration about just how unconscious racism is, I don't look like Shayna. You have to put past what you physically see in front of you to reach back and attach to those racist biases that are unconscious before you bring them to your mouth and say them. And that makes the point of just how unconscious racism is, because you're looking past what you clearly see to reach back and get something that you already think you understand about someone.
Yeah, that's so important what you're saying. And I know when in our conversations as we were preparing for this, we talked a lot about how we have this idea that humans should treat each other as humans, but unfortunately, race completely overdetermines what you are looking at when you see someone with black skin. So you're no longer Raven at JemCon, you are Raven, black woman at JemCon. Exactly. And you have to account for not only being yourself, but now answering for this issue that was brought to you. And I wanted to ask you, because I think, and I'm sure you see in the chat that a lot of people are saying that they see this all the time. And we talk about these things, but I don't know if we really talk about how it really makes one feel when they're put in this position. So Raven, if you feel comfortable talking about this, how does it really make you feel when someone approaches you and says, either why aren't you Shayna or you should be Shayna?
I have a simple question that I remember asking a person particularly, why?
Why? Why is that my limit to you? Why is that what you envision for me? Why is that the only characterization you feel is appropriate for me? Of course, I didn't say all of that out loud. I just share those to you all to share the undergirding of my simple question to them.
Now, to balance this point out, I've cosplayed Shayna before. I have some of her outfits even now. My cosplay rack is about hand reach right there. There are some times that I have cosplayed Shayna, but it isn't because I felt an obligation to. It's because she's one of the characters, just like Jem, just like Kimber, just like Stormer, just like any one of the characters, and I was cosplaying all of them. So when I'm asked that question specifically, why don't you do Shayna, or have you done Shayna? My answer to the first one, why do I have to? Why is that my limit to you? Why do you think that's the only way that I can do any of this thing? And there are people who receive that question after they asked me, and then they just stop. They just don't say anything. That conversation doesn't further anywhere beyond them considering why they were putting limits on me that I obviously hadn't imposed upon myself.
Right. No, thank you for talking about that. And to sort of continue along this, talking about the Gem universe, I know we talked a little bit about both what happened when the movie came out, and also we talked about the doll line. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of like what we talked about with regards to those two things.
Particularly, I'll begin with the movie. There were people who were complaining that the actress who was cast as Shayna, Aurora Perrineau is her name, they were complaining that she had too light skin to play Shayna. I was having a conversation with one of my white friends in the Gem universe, and she said to me expressly, I don't understand why people are in such an uproar about this actress's casting. She's a beautiful young woman. I said to her, what you're not seeing is that this particular casting of Shayna whitewashes her. It takes away the African-American complexion of Shayna in the Gem cartoon. And that was one of the things that people really gravitated toward, seeing representation in Shayna. her complexion and technically her hair texture also. I'll get to that in a minute. But when I explained to this particular friend why people were so upset about why this particular actress was cast, I was trying to explain that it's because she could have been easily cast as Keke Palmer, a dark-skinned Black young woman, to parallel the image of Shayna in the cartoon. That could have been just as easily done. The fact that it wasn't is the reason that people are upset about this. They have Shayna in name, but not the actual representation of who she was as a Black character. After I explained all of that, this is what this friend of mine in the Gem universe said to me. Well, I still don't get it. She's beautiful. I stopped at that point because there are times when you recognize when you're speaking to someone, they're either not going to hear what you're saying or they're not willing to. Either way, that's a communicative impasse at that point, and there's nothing further that can be done. So to the other issue of Shayna in her appearance in the cartoon, if you look at it carefully, she was drawn as a white woman. The difference is the complexion that was given to her skin and her hair texture. If you remove those two things and draw her as black and white, like white paper, black stencil, they're all the same. Everybody's body is the same. And a lot of times you have a lot of the hair that's the same and similar themes as that. Now, my statement of this simple technical fact does not take away from the creator's intent that there be representation, because obviously giving her a dark complexion and giving her a very, very distinct hair texture was what they tried to do in the representation. However, there's still some steps that need to be made in order for there to be the real equality that the law says exists.
Yeah, I think, look, I absolutely, and I think what, you know, and some people in the comments, and I think we've heard all weekend, that people have really loved the representation and the diversity in the cartoon. And what ends up happening when you have such little representation in the media, when you can only name one character or one show, it is so impossible for that to be everything. And this is the larger point that we need to remember. We're having a conversation about hair texture and body shape and the color of someone's skin, whether it's light or dark, because there are so few people there. And if they're only going to privilege a few different kinds of images, then we are all fighting over the same small circle where there are white people on TV everywhere. And if you have that many white people on TV, of course you're going to be able to show a much wider set of different kinds of people. But when you have one cartoon with one Black person in it, that Black person can't be everything that represents the richness of Black women. It has to be one thing. And it just becomes a mess. Representation is such a messy subject. And I think we just need to remember that if there were more people that looked like all of us here, writing, producing, creating, behind the camera, in front of the camera, this would be very different. But because mostly white folks are the ones approving scripts or they are casting people, what do you think is going to happen? So I think it's all of this, and that's to the point about your friend about saying, well, I just think she's beautiful. Racism is a sophisticated and complicated force. And I know for me, like my mother was born in Colombia and my dad was born in the United States. And I know what I look like. I am red as white, perceived as white, and I have white privilege. When I started learning about racism, it was disorienting. It was like when you really understand how sophisticated white supremacy is and compare that to what you thought you knew, it's almost impossible not to have a severe physical reaction. And that's the kind of work that we need to do. It's not just about looking at one person in one instance. Where does that one person in that one instance exist in the universe that it's created? And that's what makes it so complicated.
And that isn't just, I believe you were making this point, but that isn't just confined to Jem when we're talking about the people who wrote the scripts and who designed this and decided that. That is Hollywood worldwide. And that was part of the reason that people's reaction to the casting of Shayna in the movie was so visceral. They just, you know, they're looking at this thing happen. And I wanted to make a comment also about the idea that these things are not an accident. If you look at the movies, which have been mass produced by large studios with multi-million-dollar budgets, they can take on a theme that shows you them versus us. X-Men was about civil rights. And there were the Hunger Games, I think also another one was about civil rights. You get through all of the seasons of True Blood, I think to the 6th or the 7th, it's about civil rights. The way one group of people has determined what is and wrong, what is correct and what is wrong for someone else, and denying that other group the opportunity to decide those things for themselves. Hollywood as an entity is not stupid. They know exactly the messages that are being conveyed in the way that certain things are depicted. And I think the other thing that we were talking about was A Shark's Tale. Even when there are not human depictions of characters, you can still see the racial undertones that define how the characters relate to each other. And I stress that these things are not an accident. But to your point about how masterfully deceitful it is, as soon as someone says, oh, this is racist, if they're Black, everything they say thereafter is discredited. Why does that happen? If a woman says that she's been sexually assaulted, everything she says thereafter is discredited. It is diabolically masterful that the voices who have the strongest need to be expressed are the first ones unconsciously silenced. And that's exactly what we need to undo as we move forward as a society.
Yeah, thank you for saying that so eloquently. And I think we're bringing up a lot of things, including Jem, things that we love. And unfortunately, a lot of the things that we love, especially when it comes to popular culture, are riddled with problems. And, you know, you brought up A Shark's Tale, and I remember I was dating someone who loved The Little Mermaid. I love The Little Mermaid. And I brought up the point that you have this universe of all white mermaids, and then you have a crab that has a Jamaican accent. And I made the point that even when you create this fantasy of underwater worlds, Blackness is still there. And race and racism and these caricatures are used to inform how a crab talks. And I think you can look at, especially with Disney, but you can look at this everywhere, where you might not see a Black person, but the way that it's written is meant to be racialized. You know, in A Shark's Tale, I remember I walked out of the theater after the scene where they had 3 smaller fish that were meant to be read as delinquent fish, that you could obviously tell that the 3 voice actors were Black, and you were meant to connect, these fish are delinquent, Black is delinquent, Black fish delinquent. And this happens everywhere.
Exactly. And one of the things that I remember coming upon, we'll get into dolls in just a quick half a second, but the first thing that I was thinking about on this point is everyone's heard of the American Red Cross. We all know of the selfless ways that this organization helps people who've incurred all types of unfortunate trauma. But there was a diagram that they produced about the proper way to behave at a pool, as far as diving is concerned, as far as waiting in line is concerned, as far as using life preservers are concerned. And the way that they set this up, they had a pool, they had all of these children pictured, and they pointed to a child and said, cool, if that child was doing the right thing. And then they pointed to a different child and said, not cool, in big red letters, if that child was behaving inappropriately. Those structures seem fine, but when you look at the picture, every child that was cool, doing the right thing, was white. Every child that was doing the not cool, misbehaving actions were Black or brown. They had darker complexions that were much, much darker than those who had said to be doing all of the right things. Now, this is important because you wonder where racism continues to flourish if everybody you talk to keeps saying it's inappropriate. In the minds of children. And that's how it gets there. These children then grow up to have these concepts and these notions that Black people do the wrong things. Black people are delinquent. Black people are mouthy. Their attitudes, they're sassy, they're lazy, they don't want to work. All of those nasty things we've heard from people who are before this current generation, but also growing up into further generations, because these are the notions that are also taught to children. And those children grow up into adults who sit in Congress and block laws that would have made lynching a federal hate crime.
No, this is such an important point. And in during the Supreme Court case, the Brown versus Board of Education, which I think this is one of the only times that we really learned about this in history. But for those of you who don't know, it's the court case that said that school segregation was illegal. They included this thing called the Dahl test. And in the Dahl test, they would have young white children and young Black children. And they would ask a series of questions, and the children would have to pick a doll. The prompts that these children were given were which doll was ugly. And you saw Black children pick the Black doll and white children pick the Black doll. Which one represented a child that was misbehaving? They would overwhelmingly choose the Black doll. And then when they asked them, which doll do you identify with? The white children picked the white doll and the Black children picked the Black doll. And to your point, all of these things are ingrained by everything that you see. Like, no one is giving children like books and lessons like you're inferior. It's coming from everywhere else. And until we can really look, and part of our intent with having both the document and this discussion is that we have to start refining how we see the world so that we can see something that might look harmless, but actually is fully embedded in racism. And this, for people who aren't familiar with the Dahl test, just Google the Dahl test and you'll be able to read this research that was very important to for the Supreme Court to rule the way that they did in the 50s.
As we're talking about the way that children learn, we also we cannot escape talking about the education system and school in general. One of the things that I have learned over these years is that Black history is taught primarily as an adjunct to American history. It's always separated out. Everything is happening in the country, and then here's Black history over here. It starts with slavery and it ends with Martin Luther King, and that's it. Recent iterations of it have included still beginning with slavery, but ending with the inauguration of President Obama. And now that is supposed to be the pinnacle of all Black people all being equal. And it's not that at all in practice and the way that the way that society carries on in general. But that's the way it's presented So if anyone, I'm going to say, challenges that by talking about how racist certain societal practices still are, there are those who fall back on, oh no, the world isn't racist, we have a Black president. That's not at all even a beginning modicum of a cover for all of the things that have happened. And when you teach a child that they are slaves versus the descendants of people who were enslaved, you categorically reorient what they grow up believing about themselves. And that's the point that you're making with the doll. You look at these dolls and the Black child is saying, this doll, and what are they supposed to grow up and do and become and think after that? Abolitionist Frederick Douglass said famously, it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men.
Yeah, the business of, I refer to it as consciousness raising, to borrow from how the feminist movement and the civil rights movement talked about it in the 50s and the 60s. It is wildly difficult. And sort of as the other side to what you're talking about how Black folks are represented in US history, and a few people in the chat have been talking about this term whitewashing. Even the way, like, I have to shout out this book again. I bought it because to really learn about the Second Amendment. I talked about this in the video again. It has a tremendous amount of history about it. And one of the things that the author brings up is that part of the reason why the 13 colonies wanted to revolt against British colonial rule was that a lot of the colonists were defying British orders, and they were trying to expand their territory. And the way that they did that was via two ways. One, going into indigenous people's territory and slaughtering them. And two, the way that, and I mentioned this in the video, the way that they had slave patrols and the way that they treated Black folks. And the British were being very clear, you cannot do this, but the colonists really wanted to expand, and that was part of what informed the American Revolution. And if you look at any history book about the American Revolution, you only hear about taxation without representation, when the real meat of the matter was that they wanted to continue using slaves and killing indigenous people. And that is at the heart of what this country is founded. And when you have a constitution that talks about everything that it talks about that applies to this newly founded country, yet you have indigenous people being slaughtered, if you didn't have property, or if you were a woman, or if you were a Black person, you had no legal rights. This is where our starting point is. It's so wild to me to think that there are people that can look at that and say, how can racism exist? If the roots are rotten, the tree is going to be as rotted as the roots. I'm butchering an expression, but I hope people understand what I'm trying to say.
No, absolutely. And with that, I have 2 points I'd like to share very quickly on the books for reference. One of the books that I listed in the resource is this, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. Now, for quick explanation, a racist is someone who supports racist ideologies, point blank. An anti-racist is someone who supports equality and ideologies that equalize all people. To not be a racist is not enough. You have to be anti-racist. It's not enough just to say, oh, I don't believe what those racists believe. No, you have to say what those racists are doing is wrong. There is no neutrality when it comes to positions like that. And on this point, Another thought that I had was regarding recently passed Representative Congressman Lewis. There has been talk about naming the next voting amendment after him. Let me tell you why that makes no sense. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was finally passed that removed restrictions that were placed on Black people to prevent them from being able to register to vote. For example, you can't register to vote if you don't know how many bubbles there are in a bar of soap. You can't register to vote if you don't know how many miles there are between the earth and the sun. You can't register to vote if you can't pay the poll tax for access to the ballot. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 stripped all of that and put it away and made it equal for everyone to be able to register to vote. In this recent history of 2013, Supreme Court justices overruled parts of the Voting Act. A specific part nullifies that prohibition and now makes it legal for various counties and jurisdictions to decide for themselves how they administer the voting process, which means they can ask you how many bubbles are in a bar of soap. And if you don't know the answer, you don't get to vote. Right now, people are talking about reinstating the principles that were in the first 1965 Voting Act that were overturned by this recent decision from the Supreme Court. Again, racism is not as far back in the annals of history as we want to think it is. We're talking about the current Supreme Court. This decision to remove those prohibitions was overturned in 2013. That's recent. And people have been fighting to get the Voting Act back to what it was supposed to be. And what they're trying to suggest is that putting the Voting Act back to what it's supposed to be should be named the John Lewis Voting Amendment. And I say that's wrong because if it had been left the way that he fought to have it, change its name and leave it as it is. Don't remove its substance, then try to put the substance back and call yourself having given homage to what he did. That's as ridiculous as knowing that I own my house. You come into my house and push me out the door physically. I'm banging on the door to get back in. And then when you finally let me back into my house, you say,
Let's name this Raven's house.
It was mine the entire time. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 put those restrictions on counties and jurisdictions to keep them from racially, surgically removing those who could register to vote. And now we want to put it back and call this homage. No, it's not. What should be named after him is the amendment to the Constitution that stops voting rights from being an amendment that has to be extended and leave it in the Constitution permanently. That would be an appropriate and fitting recognition of not only his sacrifice, but those who were bruised and bloodied and died with him in this battle.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And like, I'm sure everyone has seen a lot of the fear mongering and a lot of the messages that we've been getting during this political campaign about mail-in voting, about all of this stuff. And I think we have to remember, and I'll tie it back to what Raven was saying about anti-racism, just because you personally believe that you think everyone is equal, that has no impact on the fact that people's voting rights are being denied. It has no impact on a police officer choosing to kill someone because they think that they're threatening. It has no impact. Racism is not just about the understanding that Black folks are inferior. It's that there's power attached to that. And if we don't do anything to actively transform how power is distributed in this country, then your no racist beliefs mean absolutely nothing. And it's a harsh thing to say, but it's the reality of the situation. Your beliefs change no one's lives. Your actions will change people's lives. And that's why we need to act and understand the extent to which that action is necessary. We all live in different parts of the country. It's been wonderful to see people from all the parts of this country and the world represented in this JemCon. And it's easy to start. What is your town? What is your city? What is the history of that place? What are the issues that you see come up? You can start so easily with just your community around you. And we guarantee, you will get the Raven and John guarantee that you will find some connection to something racist. And that is just how entrenched it is. It is a strategy that a certain party has fully embraced. It is a certain strategy that a very, like the conservative evangelical movement, when segregation was illegal, they attached to abortion just to further a white supremacist agenda. Like, this is the history that is everywhere and is on full display. You know, when we were talking about all of this, initially it was George Floyd. And even like this past week in Kenosha, Wisconsin, which is mind-boggling, the police are letting white supremacists kill protesters that are protesting against the murder of a Black person that was shot 7 times in the back because he broke up a fight. Like, what is going on that this is happening and the police are standing by to let it happen? Like, this is how severe this is going. It's been happening in our history forever. This is the form that it's looking like now. So just to reiterate, your beliefs don't stop a white supremacist from killing protesters. Your beliefs won't stop the police from killing and shooting someone 7 times in the back, getting in his car with his 2 children. Beliefs won't stop that, actions will.
Nikki Haley said in her message during the Republican National Convention that this country is not racist. I thought something very derogatory in my mind when I heard that, and I won't repeat what I thought. But the simple idea that someone can say in this current societal climate that this country is not racist proves what John was talking about how intrinsic and deep these misguided notions really are. And you also understand what a statement like that will do to a particular demographic of supporters.
Yeah, I mean, anytime, like, I read an article about the Republican National Convention, and anytime they had a Black person speak or a person of color speak, whether it was a US senator, a former ambassador, a former governor, it was to tell white people what you're feeling about racism is correct, that it doesn't exist, and this group of people that keep raising the alarm about it are crazy. And it is such dangerous thinking that will only make this racist foundation that's been here for hundreds of years so much worse. And we're seeing it play out every single day, every single week. Some new horrific thing is happening, and it's only being emboldened and signed off by the person with the highest position of electoral power in this country. It is, I mean, nothing really to say besides that.
It is, absolutely. And at this time, I would like to introduce Liz. All of us already know her, but introduce is my word. And after a statement from Mother JemCon, we will open the floor to take a couple of questions that have been coming in during the discussion. Liz?
So as this panel has gone on, my thoughts on what I should say have gone back and forth and all over the place. And I think the most relevant thing that I can say as a person who is painfully white, a person of great privilege, question things. If something puts your back up, if you say that can't be, question why you think that. Look into it. And we are all here in what, as far as I can tell so far, is a safe space with people who care about us and who are largely reinforcing our beliefs. And that is a wonderful feeling. But you need to take the love and the passion that you have and take it outside this group. And if you find yourself asking a question about, is this something I, as a white person or a person who is not Black, should do? Well, maybe, maybe not, but I think I'm going to become comfortable with it. Take that back and think about it some more. This is horrifying. And I can say, as someone who considers herself very liberal, very educated, very thoughtful, I have seen things this year that I did not know. And I will continue to see things that I did not know, and I think all of us will. And there is no shame in ignorance. There is shame in knowing things and acting as if you did not know them. So do your best. If you fail, you fail. If you need to cry, cry. And then get back up. Love you.
I love that point, Liz. I love that point. You brought our discussion full circle. We began with the idea that people's influence determines the things that they can bring into JemCon and then spew those things, unfortunately. Your point was the opposite of that, that we take the love and the acceptance that we know in this community outward. That was a fantastic circle of everything that we've been discussing. Absolutely, absolutely. And as far as not knowing, we've provided a list of resources for you to begin your journey into this new form of awareness, if we want to call it that. The last page of the guiding document includes references for where we've gotten some of the statistics that we've quoted tonight, as well as the next to last page, the penultimate page, is exactly titled a resource list. So you have books, you have articles, and many of you are raising small children. You don't necessarily have a lot of time to read. We've listed some movies that you can watch that illustrate these points as well, so that as overwhelming as all of this new information might be, you don't have to feel adrift. You don't have to feel lost. There are people here to whom you can address your questions, as well as begin with these resources. The book that John was citing, the one that I had here, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and many, many of the other ones that are available to help your personal education on these matters, and share that with other people. When you're questioning your own assertions and your own beliefs about what is and not appropriate, you can challenge other people along those same lines regarding what they say that they deem is appropriate, and you understand now that it may not be. And with that, Encore, I'd like to ask if you have any questions and open the floor to them. If there were none, I think.
Well,
closing
Raven, I
statements.
saw someone ask on the chat that,
Yeah.
and it was directed primarily to the white folks, I think, in the room. How have they successfully had conversations with some of their friends or family members who have racist views? And I just want to say this. I mean, I think everyone can have a lot of people probably have an example of that not being successful conversation. But one of the things that I have some experience and some history doing having these kinds of conversations. And the thing that's been most effective, and I might get choked up because Liz just did me in, and this whole conversation is doing me in. Everyone, there is one thing, at least one thing, that we all share as humans on this planet, and that is pain and loss. And because of how our world has been structured, so many people bear the brunt of that disproportionately, and it is fact. And Black people, Indigenous peoples, trans people, all of these folks bear the disproportionate impact of pain, of losing their homes, losing their communities, losing their lives, and everyone knows what it feels like to lose something. And if you can connect that to, okay, you've had a loved one die, you've lost a friend, you've lost a job, you've lost something, imagine what this entire group of people must feel when they feel what you're experiencing on top of this disproportionality of it. So if you can, it is tough work to do. It is delicate work to do, but if you can connect the pain and suffering that we all share and highlight the disproportionate impact it has on certain people, I think you might have a higher risk of a successful conversation. Raven, Raven, do you have a success story or a positive experience of talking to someone who you were able to even change their mind a little bit?
Not in my own experience, but there is one that I could share with you. There was if I can recall this story correctly, there was a Black woman, a white man, and his 5-year-old child. They had gone into a movie and they watched the whole movie. I don't remember what the movie was, but by the time the movie was over, they were coming out and the child was talking about how negatively the Black people that were depicted in the movie were. And that happened to, of course, a 5-year-old wouldn't have known to say it that way, but let's say, for instance, if it was a shark's tail, the child was talking about how the fish who were characteristically Black were stupid, or they were running into the wrong things, or whatever they were doing that wasn't correct. And that happened to make it toward the ear of a Black woman, who then approached the father respectfully and asked, why do you think he thinks that? Or, you know, just introduce a dialogue. By the time that they had finished that conversation, that father was aware of the changes that he would need to make in the life of his son. That is definitely a positive way to go. As I mentioned, my own personal experiences are very limited in having successful conversations where I can see that someone's mind has been changed about the way that they regarded me or any aspect of myself. But that was definitely one that I remember having heard that ended very positively.
No, thank you for sharing that. And I see in the chat, Liz, I think you have a question to ask us from someone.
Yeah, Christine has brought this up, and it is something I have been thinking about and continue to think about. And the question is, what can this JemCon community do to increase diversity within itself so that it's not just a white space? And I think that we can continue to do this. We can continue to have panels on diversity of all types. We can continue to have discussions about the Black Lives Matter movement, because that's what we are. We are a group that gets together and talks about stuff and relates to each other. We can also look at, well, I'm going to stop talking and see if anyone else has a view on this.
I agree. And I think one of the, dare I say, challenges we might find in that is that Gem is a very, very specific and particular niche. And it would be a little bit difficult to branch out to other cosplay worlds and say, here we are, would you like to join with us? Can we have a con together or something? Because there aren't enough things that parallel their interests with ours that would make that an attractive proposition to them. However, I don't think there's any harm in trying that. And we just reach out to people and see, you know, our individual connections that we might have. Let's say someone who is a huge Star Wars fan. We could talk to them about what we do. And even if it's just to invite them to the specific social awareness situations, at least there's that bridge that we're creating. Even if we might encounter the difficulty of not having as many apparent similarities as we do amongst ourselves.
Yeah, I have nothing of substance to add to that. Both of those answers are wonderful.
We got some hands raised. Let me see what the order they were in. Damon.
And
Hi, good afternoon. First of all, thank you so much, Liz, Raven, Anchor, all of you all, Jonathan, for organizing this very important discussion. This is a really beautiful experience to be. As a Black and Mexican man who is part of this community and has been part of this community since day one of airing of the show, this is a wonderful chance for this community to get together. One of the things that I really wanted to kind of bring to the forefront of the discussion of what Black Lives Matter and what we can do and what people can do who aren't people of color to have those conversations and to keep those going is to remember that, you know, I think one of the biggest triggers that some people have when they hear Black Lives Matter is they hear only Black Lives Matter or Black Lives Matter more. And what we have to remind people is that's not the case. And we have to give the analogy of the houses, right? There's 9 houses, mine and yours. None of the houses are more important than the other. Mine doesn't matter than yours. Our neighbor's house is on fire. We have to call the fire department. And who does the fire department show up to? All of the houses? They all matter, right? Or the house that's on fire.
right.
We need you all to be the fire department and put that house out. Right now, the Black community is on fire and we need you to be the fire department. Then the next thing I want to say is that about white privilege is that it's not a weaponized term. It is neither earned nor anything to be ashamed of or anything to be proud of. It just simply is. And when people are accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression.
Yes, absolutely.
And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's no accident that anytime, and we see this, there are 4 areas where this comes to mind when any organizing happens around Black people, around immigrants, around gay people, or about trans people. The response is always special rights. And there's so many terms that are used to make it seem like we are asking for something out of the ordinary.
Right.
And we have to continue correcting people, and either through analogy or through just saying, like, you obviously heard that Black Lives Matter meant only Black Lives Matter because you shared a meme and you just believed it. You didn't go to the Black Lives Matter website, which has a lot of resources, a lot of information, and you didn't look at it to really understand. And I think we see this a lot in social media where people will just come in and say what they need to say, but they're not really participating in the discussion with good faith. If being anti-racist or understanding racism or caring for any community is truly important to you, you would not come into a discussion and say it's racist to say that something is racist, or you would not come into a discussion about Black Lives Matter and say all lives matter, all this stuff. So figure out what your priorities are. And if they're not, if you are trying to come into our discussion, into our universe, and you don't think any of this exists, then I'm sorry to say, but you don't belong here. And you don't belong in the conversation. Sorry. Like, there's certain people that you are being trolls and are being assholes. No reasoning with them. If people come to you in good faith and say, I don't understand this, explain it to me, explain away.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes, I agree. And we have another hand that's raised, and we are over time. So after this last hand that we have up, we'll have to close so that we can get ready for the next panel that's coming up at 6 o'clock. I was about to say 5 because I'm in Central Time, but 6 o'clock for you guys. But yes, thank you all so much. We have our last hand, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
And that's John Henry.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
I got you. Hold on.
Hey guys, we're in the same house. Yeah, I do some of this for work, this kind of thing that Brandy's talking about, to the convincing white people of things, and trying to help them understand. And like Damon's example was so great because it was so simple and so wonderful. Yes. The way you put that example, you have to really break it down for people and give them some kind of thing they can latch onto, I think, when you have those conversations. And the story I used about this specific situation, or I used to use before the world changed, was a woman going on a date with a Black man for the first time. He has a stuffed animal in his car, in the back of his car window. And she's like, do you have kids? I thought you didn't have kids. And he's like, I have to keep that there because if a guy stops me, if a police stop me and I don't have that there, it's going to be a lot more trouble for me. And it's kind of a shorthand. She knew that was a true fact of what he said because she's a Black woman, he's a Black man. She knows what the life is like. And it was very good shorthand. And that story kind of puts it all in perspective. So I think those stories and examples, like what Damon said, are really helpful. And I think for the JemCon diversity, we've had so much luck here this weekend with the virtual JemCon. We have people and faces and in the conversation that aren't always here. So I think having this forum is really important to help maintain the diversity of JemCon, because we can have a quarterly or monthly kind of meetup, just an hour conversation to kind of get together. And then when we actually get together, we're aiming to do that, and really want to be together again. So I think the diversity I've seen on the calls, just because we've been able to reach more people virtually, has been a thing we should keep in mind to keep JemCon diverse. But I'll hand it back to the co-host to close it out.
Thank you all again so much for joining us for this important discussion, for sharing your thoughts and everything that you've added to the chat that we've been able to see some of and have them address it. This has been a wonderfully refreshing opportunity to be able to share these things openly and without reprisal, because as I mentioned, as a Black person, the first thing I say is, if something is racist, nobody's going to listen to anything I say afterwards. That wall needs to be demolished in the minds of so many people who hear these kinds of things. And with that, make sure you print out your research guide, check out the information that is in there. You can still ask us any questions that you have about the information contained therein. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much. Mwah.
Bye.
We can